Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special event hosted by the Department of Political Science at Carleton University in Ottawa. My name is Eleanor Sloan, and I'm chair of the department. Ours is one of the largest political science departments in Canada, with 35 full-time faculty teaching across a wide range of subjects. We're also one of the founding departments at Carleton, with a history dating back to 1942. The title of this event is Racism's Raw Materials, a presentation by Professor Robert Vitalis of the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Mira Sukharov, also from our department, will introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Eleanor. It's a pleasure to welcome Bob Vitalis to Carleton University here online, and a pleasure to welcome all of you from near and far. Bob Vitalis is a full professor at University of Pennsylvania. He joined in 1999 and at the time directed the Middle East Center. So Bob's trajectory has mirrored something similar of my own in starting really in regional studies and then moving into IR, international relations. And what I really welcomed about Bob's scholarship, and some of my students are here right now, and they also welcomed it. We had a wonderful discussion about one of Bob's 4 books last semester. We talked about his 2016 book called White World Order, Black Power Politics with Cornell University Press. And for that book, he won the International Theory Prize from the Department of IR at University of Sussex. And there, what he did was he looked at the racialized history, what he calls the unwritten history of IR scholarship in the US, and looking at the African-American thinkers that have challenged the discipline's racist and imperialist commitments. And I think thanks to scholars like Bob and others, we are much more aware of the types of syllabi that we create and whose voices and whose thinking is included and not included. And of course, pedagogy is wonderful in that way, in that it's a work in progress, and we can improve on the kinds of teaching we're doing now, thanks to scholarship like Bob's, compared to what we may have done in the past. Now, Bob's newest book is called Oilcraft, The Myths of Scarcity and Security That Haunt U.S. Energy Policy. That's with Stanford University Press in 2020. And Pulitzer Prize-winning author Greg Grandin has called that book, quote, indispensable to understanding the current moment, showing that moving beyond fossil fuels is more akin to quitting a sect than breaking an addiction. Wow, those are 2 tough analogies that he's pitted against each other. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the talk tonight. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Professor Robert Vitalis.
It is a pleasure to be here. And by here, I mean my own home, and still be able to engage you all. So I hope you're not going to be disappointed. As Mira said, I wrote this. I think I was invited or contacted or considered because I went and wrote this book a few years back, White World Order, Black Power Politics. As she said, in it, I try to upend the story professors in international relations in the United States tell about themselves. And instead, I demonstrate how deeply entangled the discipline was in the imperialism that constituted world order and the racism that infected all quarters of American life. And at the end of that project, it's always seemed to me the real question is, how could it have been otherwise, right? And how did we ignore it for so long? And again, as Mira pointed out, I also kind of uncovered the work of those African-American scholars who were actually trying to oppose or challenge the commitment to preserving white supremacy, which was central to the discipline's foundation. Now, those thinkers have long since been written out of the discipline's history. So one of the field's leaders told me in the midst of denying me funding for the study, that it was crazy to study African-Americans in international relations because no African-Americans ever wrote anything of importance to international relations. Well, that turns out to be, nothing could be farther from the truth. So here's the deal though, as Mira said, that's 2016. I've got this, and you can find many versions of that talk online if anyone's interested in the pictures that I use for that one. I've written this new book, Oilcraft, The Myths of Scarcity and Security That Haunt U.S. Energy Policy. And I didn't draw attention to this at the end of the book, okay? But in its conclusion, as I wrestled with the implications of, or no, sorry, I'm confusing you. In the conclusions to White World Order, okay, though I didn't draw attention to this, where I was wrestling with the implications of this hidden history for the present, I was previewing arguments for two more books. One of them has just come out, Oilcraft, okay? So what I'd like to do here with you is show that when it comes to oil, I want to show how racism remains an unrecognized component of the strategic thought of most action-oriented intellectuals and the policymakers they dream of influencing. And it turns out to be true as well for those, for their chief antagonists, for lack of a better term. That is, those critics on the left who believe that the United States somehow commands the globe through its alleged control of the Persian Gulf. So first, I'm going to explain the title and main argument of the book and then trace how racism matters to it. So now you might hear that term oilcraft and think it's a variant on statecraft, okay? One that recognizes the centrality of oil to national security, to US power and the like, you know, the way so many so-called specialists in US foreign policy, journalists, and public intellectuals imagine and repeat like a mantra. But I don't mean that, right? Rather, I mean it as an analog to witchcraft, okay? And I believe that really helps us understand this picture, okay? Look, European and American men of science once believed in witches. This scientist, for example, Sir Francis Bacon, right? They were sure that witches existed and acted on this basis, even though we know they don't. And actually what happens now is we have a hard time understanding how people ever did believe these things, right? Now, you also may believe that that analogy is outrageous and unfair. Surely our modern, rational, social, scientific, and secular world and its beliefs about oil as special, the lifeblood of civilization and the like, is a very different world. So if that's the case, if that's how you're thinking, let's try another example. Let's take race, okay? The puzzle for Karen and Barbara Fields, shown here in conversation with my friend and colleague Adolph Reed Jr., the puzzle for them is how and why a scientifically discredited, utterly false idea that humans are naturally divided into distinct groups identifiable by certain physical and other traits, why do these beliefs persist? Despite our, scientists undermining this every generation, right? So they consider it a kind of magical thinking or imagining that people find impossible to let go of. These two people, for example. So racecraft is their term for the rational process of reasoning that makes race appear to the mind and imagination as a vivid truth, right? And they go on to argue that the terrain of these false ideas exist, or false beliefs exist, and can be analyzed. They can be analyzed on their own terms, right? And importantly for them, in terms of the work that these ideas do, that is their effects. The main and insidious one is the continuing legitimation of inequality. So Oilcraft argues that what is true about the idea of race and its relationship to the mental terrain of racecraft is true as well about the magical properties that oil, an ordinary commodity, accrues as it transits along or through oilcraft territory. That is, widespread beliefs about oil as power and the putative need, let alone the ability to secure access or stabilize prices or prevent hostile powers from holding the world economy hostage, also have no basis in fact. Evidence for the belief, such as it is, continues to accumulate in the form of US officials, past and present, proclaiming about these things, like here early in the 1940s after World War II. Okay? So they proclaim about these things, and starting in 1979, shifting the US military presence from Southeast Asia to the Persian Gulf, right? Now, the anti-imperialist left takes these same claims about access, the need to get, secure oil against enemies, et cetera. Well, they take these same claims alone at face value, right? That is, any other kind of claim that an administration makes about why it pursues some kind of policy is typically treated as a lie or fake or efforts to bamboozle us. But when it comes to claims about oil, that's real. There's the truth, plain and simple, right? And why do they do that? Because it seems to confirm their own deep-rooted beliefs in big oil, as they say now, or fossil capital's needs, and or about how the US exerts its hegemony over would-be capitalist rivals. Only nothing that policymakers armed with these incantations have done can be shown to have made the price of petroleum more stable than other commodities traded on the world market, or to have secured for refiners greater quantities at lower prices than had the same policymakers refrained from doing all the things that they have done in its name, from feting kings in the 1950s to designating the Persian Gulf a vital national interest, to launching wars in 2003, well, wars without end in 2003. As the fields argue, real actions create evidence for the imagined thing and constantly dumps factitious evidence for itself in the real world. Now, a key feature of the mental terrain of Oilcraft is what the environmental engineer turned historian Roger Stern calls, that's my war without end in 2003. Roger Stern says, a lot of this is due to what he calls oil scarcity ideology. That is, Stern argues that moments of perceived decline in the world's known oil reserves, a false conclusion for which the only real evidence is that prices are rising, along with those of all other commodities, by the way, have repeatedly led to aggressive actions. Some fear that rival powers are conspiring to gain exclusive control of foreign sources of supply. This was Michael Clare's a big argument during the time of the Gulf War, and he had this windfall, like 3 books, 2 documentaries, right? We're at war with China to command what's left, and hence that's his explanation for the war. Or others believe that producing countries such as Iraq under Saddam Hussein or a less friendly Saudi monarchy will choose not to sell their oil as a kind of war on the same world economy on which they depend for their revenue. So, okay, there's a little puzzle there. Now, I'm more cautious than Roger is in relying on the many histories that take for granted that states have repeatedly acted on these grounds. At times, policymakers may have, at times not. The problem is that the historians, as believers themselves in the truth of the proposition that oil is power, often fail their discipline's norm of due diligence in judging evidence and questioning assumptions. So, a mistake he, Roger, and most other historians who write about the international politics of oil in the 20th century, a mistake that they made is that in the 1920s and again in the 1950s, the statesmen and their varied ventriloquists fretted about access to control of all sorts of raw materials, right? Oil was then just one, and by no means the most important or most vital of resources, though we have forgotten this. So in 1947, when historian and economist Herbert Fife, who served as the economic advisor for international affairs in the Hoover and Roosevelt administrations, when he looked back on supply problems in World War II, it was the shortage of rubber, he said, not oil, that presented the greatest threat to the safety of our nation and the success of the Allies' cause. So many materials mattered in the war. Scholars today are barely aware of how radically they recast the past in order to tell their stories about the only one that seems to matter now. Okay, here's an example. Okay, the bestseller, The Doorstopper. So in Oilcraft, I return to the debates in the 1920s and 30s about the so-called laws that statesmen and other engineers of empire back then said compelled the pursuit of control of natural resources, else suffer the consequences. Now, as I said, much about that era has been forgotten, not least the rejection of the validity of these claims as irrational. Okay. Nikolai Bukharin is a case in point. Okay. Believe it or not, Bukharin, who was then editor of Izvestia, although he would soon be tried and executed by Stalin, published a remarkable piece in, of all places, Foreign Affairs in 1936. And in it, he attacks what he calls the two pseudosciences of race and geopolitics. He said, these fantasies provide the excuse for fascist expansionism and mislead those in the West whose responses to the crisis of German expansionism drew on the same false ideas, e.g. about the need for land of raw or raw materials. But here's what I found out, and I'm kind of quite excited about. A decade before Bukharin, a set of young progressive PhDs in the history department at Columbia University, Leland Jenks, Edward Mead Earle, and Parker Moon, they had begun to challenge what they called the bogeys, phantoms, and mirages behind the new imperialism. And Columbia at that point became the central place for the study of imperialism in the 1920s. Okay. And so they sort of said these rationales, the bogeys and phantoms, are behind the new imperialism of the era and of leaders' pursuit of the ever elusive security of supply of vital resources. Now today we don't use the phrases bogeys and phantoms. Professors at Columbia today talk about strategic rationales. Okay? The Columbia School thinkers were at their best in exposing what Ed Earle, and Earle would later become famous for pioneering the field of security studies in the United States. Well, he becomes famous for what he called the era's pathological nationalism, with its impossible dreams of self-sufficiency. And the idea, right, which he's debunking, that a nation's security was somehow enhanced, say, by a British firm rather than a French one holding the concession somewhere for oil or rubber or copper. Much of what these scholars wrote back then remains valid today, and their arguments have been reproduced unknowingly by successive generations of critics. Okay. But I won't say anything more about the nationalist and or mercantilist strands in geopolitical thought, okay? What I want to do for the rest of the time is focus on the racism, which was not recognized by the Columbia School thinkers, far from it, at the time, that also is entangled in or informed strategic thought back then. And I'd add, it still does today. Okay, so in the 1920s, whites evinced great fear that their days were numbered. They faced an existential threat, they said, from the so-called darker and inferior peoples of the world. Here's the cover of a best-selling book from 1920, right? The Rising Tide of Color, The Threat Against White World Supremacy, a book that it seems to me appears very of the moment, in fact. I'm surprised they haven't republished it. And what was going on then when Stoddard wrote Rising Tide of Color? The U.S. had closed its borders. Australia had passed the White Australia Party. The great migration of African Americans from the Jim Crow South led to the resurrection of the Ku Klux Klan, this time in the northern and western states. And everywhere, empire seemed under threat by the prospect that subject peoples are rising off to throw off European domination. For instance, here in Egypt in 1919, a classic example from that moment. So back then, a new assistant professor of international relations at Yale, Nicholas Spikeman, and another future pioneer of security studies, it turns out, Spikeman traced the rise of Asiatic nationalism and creation of movements for political independence from India and Java to Indochina, the Philippines and Egypt, due, he said, and others said, to the increasingly capitalist nature of imperialism. Another widely read book at the time, The White Man's Dilemma by Nicholas Peffer. Peffer was a journalist and China expert who would later become a professor of international relations at Columbia. Peffer describes the problem in a nutshell. Whites needed the raw materials found in Africa and Asia, but would not be able to continue to control them without the use of force. Why? Because, as many insisted, a fanatical fear and hatred of the West drove the Asiatics, Mohammedans, and brown and yellow races on their quixotic quest for self-determination. So what I want to draw attention to now is a wrinkle in the familiar arguments that we all know, or kind of associate with that period, arguments about civilizing missions and the white man's burden and the like that drove the empire building of the 19th century. Post-World War I defenders of the imperial order began to insist that the raw materials found in the tropics and semi-tropics were by right the heritage of mankind. As Frederick Lugard, the former governor of Nigeria, framed the problem in his classic The Dual Mandate in British Tropical Africa, Lugard says that the races that inhabited these places possessed no rights to deny the bounties to those who need them. It was a matter of life or death, he wrote. The cotton, groundnuts, rubber, and so forth had become essential to the very existence of the races of the temperate climes. Sure, he argued, we could do a better job protecting the legitimate interests of the inhabitants, but they could not be permitted to exert a spurious sovereignty over the resources themselves. These ideas became unshakable truths for the settler colonies. For instance, in 1949, Elspeth Huxley, the British-born settler in Kenya and author of White Man's Country and many other books, you find her in Foreign Affairs too, arguing that the so-called Black Belt, and we don't mean the south of the United States, but everywhere there are darker races, the Black Belt was crucial to England's survival, and so there was no choice but to slow down the pace of political advancement or decolonization, as it came to be called. Now, what is remarkable is how these same arguments were taken up by US defense intellectuals and others in the Cold War in opposition to the independence wave gaining ground in Asia and Africa. So the future management guru, Peter Drucker, insisted that the United States had become a have-not nation. I don't know if you know that phrase, but it's what the fascists insisted was true about Germany and Japan in the 1930s in support of their claims for getting back their colonial possessions and later for seizing control of Eastern Europe and East Asia. The father of containment, George Kennan, embraced the heritage of mankind idea and said that the Venezuelans and others had no rights over resources that they, and I'm quoting him here, had not moved a finger to create this wealth and were incapable of developing it themselves. And what I'm arguing here is that this was the default view of all those who sought to rehabilitate the imagined science of geopolitics, from Kissinger's mentor at Harvard, William Yandell Elliott, to militant right-wingers such as Robert Strauss-Hupé and Stefan Pisoni. It's where they divined the truth that colonialism had to be preserved, that they would argue that the injustices were a thing of the past, and they actually made proposals that NATO step in to take over from Britain, France, Belgium, and Portugal for a better, and I kid you not, I'm just quoting them directly, a happier colonialism where subject peoples would finally recognize that their natural resources were truly a trust for the world. Now, if one considers these hard-headed geopolitical truths to be self-evident, then it must be the case, as indeed was argued over and over again, that the problem was the irrational, mad, double-dealing, fanatical, hateful, et cetera, nature of the leaders of anti-colonial movements in newly independent countries, including, but by no means limited to Mossadegh in Iran, Sukarno in Indonesia, Nasser in Egypt, Nehru in India, Ben Bella in Algeria, Qasim in Iraq, Sihanouk in Cambodia, and Nkrumah in Ghana, Jagan in Guyana, and Lumumba in the Congo. Now, of course, none of the militant realists, apocalyptic visions, predictions of Europeans' collapse, new brutal wars of conquest if the West were to leave their colonies, and not least the irreplaceable loss, right, of vital raw materials came true. None of them. The fears of what I call the raw materialists proved unfounded, as was true, by the way, of the racists' belief in the inevitability of race war in all those raw material producing countries were national movements there ever to gain power. So what did the militants in international relations get wrong? A great deal, in fact, but most basically, economic nationalism, including the expropriation and nationalization of Western holdings in mineral production, plantation agriculture, and the like, did not mean the end of export production. Far from it. Industrializing countries needed the foreign exchange revenues from raw material exports to pay for the Western capital goods and technologies that would allow countries like Egypt, here's Nasser at the High Dam in in the late 1950s, but not just in Egypt, in India, Brazil, Pakistan, and others. It was the revenues from export production that would permit them to build the domestic textile, steel, automobile, pharmaceuticals, and weapons industries. Many in the West opposed these industrialization policies, to remember back decades ago. But many Western firms, however, happily continued to do business with the so-called socialist states and state-owned enterprises. And the main examples of loss of raw material exports to Western markets occurred only when the United States imposed or went along with embargoes. For instance, on Iranian oil in the 1950s, or on Cuban sugar after Castro's revolution. The United States is at it still. Think about what countries are being embargoed right now that are raw material producers, oil producers in particular, Venezuela, Iran, and before the defeat of Gaddafi, Libya, right? The United States is still stemming the flow of raw materials, but we never described this as an assault on the world economy, as folks did rush to do when the Iranians fired a few missiles at Saudi oil facilities last year. And people like Stephen Cook in his co-authors Brands and Polak argued in Foreign Affairs that we were abandoning the Carter Doctrine, and then the world would move into chaos, and the Carter Doctrine being so successful and so forth. Okay, so look, Americans suffered a kind of national trauma in 1973 as the world experienced the oil price revolution, when decision power shifted from private oil companies to the oil producing states, and the companies' assets were taken over and nationalized. Now, we don't have time to discuss all the crazy beliefs we harbor about the so-called oil crisis, beginning with the myth of an OPEC embargo. I just stole that slide from someone else's talk. OPEC never embargoed anyone, but it's repeated over and over again in book after book, okay? And if you're interested in these things, I have a whole chapter about the 1973 crisis. But this is when all the hand-wringing about the need to control raw materials of all sorts, the Eisenhower administration was caught up in, et cetera. this is when all that hand wringing kind of, it ceases, right? And instead, the past starts to get rewritten as if it has always been one raw material alone, oil, the prize that drove the struggle for wealth and power. Okay? The racism, though, survives intact. For instance, as when the Washington Post wrote that King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, who led the wholly ineffectual Arab, not OPEC embargo of the US, the Netherlands, Portugal, and South Africa. You see here all sorts of crazy things claimed about Europe itself had been embargoed and so forth, right? And they led it for a few short months and it did nothing, okay? Still, the Washington Post argued that Faisal had done more damage to the West than anyone since Hitler. Or when the Shah of Iran, who happily took US market share from Saudi Arabia by selling us all the oil we wanted at the higher prices prevailing on the market at that time, well, he was deemed insane by Secretary of Treasury William Simon. The Shah's a nut. The racism was and is palpable in the campaign by militant right thinkers and think tanks to seize Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and so forth in the 1970s. Folks, I don't know if you caught up with this, like a document was released in the past week that said, you know, U.S. Kissinger planning to take over Saudi Arabia or threatening to take over Saudi Arabia. Well, look at this document I put up here. We knew that 20 years ago, okay? But in the U.S. was talking about seizing an oil well or two, an oil country or two. Okay? And why? In order to reverse this imagined blow to the West. The representation of the producing countries in those years was subject to a baseless double standard. It was called crime, racket, piracy, and price hijack. And we get that in place of the paternalism that was the convention. Okay. Now, even those who argued against seizing an oil field or two, save as a last resort, such as Daniel Jurgen, and that was Jurgen making his first tentative foray into the topic in the New York Times Magazine in 1975, was only his second piece he ever published. The first one was on the Chomskyan revolution in linguistics, but he's writing about oil in 75, and sort of saying, you know, we should only take over the oil fields as a last resort. But he condemned the price shock as unjust, when the reality is that the producers had seen the value of their only export and source of wealth decline with the end of Bretton Woods, the devaluation of the dollar, and the inflated cost of Western capital and consumer goods. What the relative price rise of that time did, right? Of that decade, what it actually represents is the efforts of the oil producers at staying even for the inflated costs of all the goods that they had been buying, and for all their dollars that were now all of a sudden worth a lot less. Okay. Now the right, okay, this is where I'm getting to, the right reached for the common heritage of mankind idea in the 1970s. But by then the history had been forgotten. Oh, and by the way, the World Wildlife Fund, right, started by the eugenicist Julian Huxley, also used the common heritage of mankind and the belief in the irrationality of those folks in Africa who would not be willing or need or understand the reason to protect their grasslands and livestock and so forth, or wild animals. And that Julian Huxley also called it one of the, a common heritage of mankind, and is what the World Wildlife Fund was devoted to doing, right? So the right reaches for these ideas all over again, but the history had been forgotten. And we find scholars imagining it as a new idea. So we also find various folks trying to breathe life into it again from time to time. Stanford professor Stephen Krasner being one of them during the 1990s, when political scientists were talking about failed states and advocating varieties of neo-trusteeship arrangements, right? And of course, we still find armchair strategists such as Walter Russell Mead clinging to the madman imaginary of a Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden or some other dictator holding the world's energy supplies hostage or raising its price or otherwise acting in defiance of markets. They refuse to understand that oil is increasingly just another commodity, essentially similar to cocoa, tin, and pig's bellies. You know who I'm quoting here? Douglas Fife, one of the neoconservative architects of the Bush administration's 2003 invasion of Iraq, by the way, who said that oil is subject to the laws of supply and demand, as are all commodities in trade. And there was nothing special one needed to do to get to have access to it, okay? Or certainly one need not ingratiate oneself to any oil regime or do anything special to secure it. This was, in fact, the conventional wisdom of the White House in 2003, according to Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Steve Coll. Whatever else we imagine about seizing oil, taking it over, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, the left thinks something quite different. Convinced that the US state acts as in the Persian Gulf, in Iraq, and across the global South in the interests of big oil, of fossil capital, and so forth. Their racism is different. Back in the 1970s, and in fact until now, the argument was that Saudis and other producers couldn't possibly have engineered the price revolution, and that in reality, it was the Western oil firms pulling the strings. They see the Saudis or any other oil producing country that is an ally rather than an enemy of the United States. The enemies we like, the left likes, right? The allies, though, are simply treated as puppets doing the hegemon's business. Now, the left today is where we are most likely to find arguments about oil or carbon or energy being part of, yes, the common heritage of mankind, while unaware that the argument originates with the arch-imperialist Lord Lugard. Instead, they tell a very strangely depoliticized story about the norm supposedly originating in the 1960s with the Maltese diplomat Arvid Pardo and his longtime collaborator, Elizabeth Mann Borghese, who advanced it in the context of the UN Conference on the Law of the Sea. The funny thing is, though, that folks then were still aware, Borghese herself, were still aware of how the past impinged on the present. So take most famously the Algerian jurist, a fantastic man, Mohammed Bejawi. Bejawi, who was an advisor to the revolutionary Algerian government and was a key figure in both the negotiations over the UN Law of the Sea treaty and the new international economic order. Bejawi embraced the norm, right? He said this would be a good idea. It was kind of like a jujitsu move on the part of what was then the third world, doing what they possibly could to try to prevent the continued takeover of whatever resources remained, particularly the continental shelf oil-bearing lands, and later their belief that there were manganese resources at the bottom of the ocean, right? So they held out the norm of common heritage of mankind to try to stop the West, but Bejawi was smart enough to say this, right? Or let me put it this way, he warned explicitly of co-optation. Quoting him, "What is yours is ours, and what is ours is our own," seems to be the disquieting slogan of the well-off states in their dealings with the developing countries. And sure enough, 50 years later, it is important that defenders of the idea today, energy, commons, people, think the law of the sea is had this remarkable positive effect, when really what's important is that they recognize instead, as some historians have been discovering, the parochial, illiberal, and imperial dimensions of the common heritage of mankind idea. The same is true, by the way, because maybe you believe in the commons too, but you are thinking of the tragedy of the commons. Well, that was first proposed by environmentalist Garrett Hardin in 1968. Hardin, of course, himself was a white supremacist and champion of eugenics. Okay? So to sum all this up, as Erin Pineda has argued recently and more generally, the conceptual underpinnings of the global racial order continue to live within the concepts that structure our fields, though they are often taught and discussed and debated as if they had little to do with race. Now, why does this matter? The short answer is that by omission or commission, the majority of the world's population that is not yet part of advanced post-industrial society face the prospect yet again of not counting, or at least not counting as much in the, quote, dreams of reconciling sustainability and well-being represented by the Green New Deal and other false visions of surefire solutions to climate change globally. Now, and while I share the environmental movement's alarm about climate change, as Joshua Goldstein and Steven Pinker have shown, Western activists who seek to overthrow the fossil fuel regime would do so, even if many billions of people in the global South will have to bear the cost. And that's a variant of an old story. And I'm done. Stay healthy, okay? And safe.
Okay, thank
And
you,
write,
Bob.
if you're unhappy with anything or want to know more, write to me and I'll have more time to kind of think about things, okay? See you.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody.
Good night.
Bye. Thank you. Thanks for being here. All right.